Welcome, welcome.
Hello. Just making sure this works too.
All right. College puddings, academia and the Beatles. Several years ago, at a conference at, I believe it was spearheaded by one Kenneth Womack in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Yes. I was talking with Mark Lewison, who said he loved the conference, he loves the fest, and he wished that there were more opportunities in the fest environment to introduce an academic thread, to acknowledge and embrace that academic thread. Well, you wish it, and here it is. So how about, first of all, an opening round of applause for the distinguished panel that we have before us. I am going to ask, I sort of cheated and mentioned that Ken Womack is up there, but how about, Susan, would you like any opening comments?
Yes, so I wasn't at the conference in Pennsylvania, but I've been to two academic conferences, another one that Ken spearheaded and another one in Rochester, New York. I went to one, a 4-day conference at Monmouth University about the White Album, and it was the first time I've attended that kind of a conference, and it was amazing. The fests are fabulous, they are wonderful, but the level of scholarship at these academic conferences is absolutely up in the stratosphere, off the chain. And then I went again to a conference in 2019 at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester for the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road, which was also wonderful. And I think that Mark was onto something when he said he wished there was more opportunity for academic discussion at the fest. Because I think many fans, obviously, judging by the people who are in the room, many fans want that sort of higher, almost higher level discussion. I mean, I don't think I'm wrong, right? I know our panelists are biased, but so we have a distinguished panel here who will tell us all about higher education and academic study of the Beatles, which was not a thing when I was in college, or it would have been my major. So, you know, and it would have graduated with the highest honors, but okay, because it would have been fun.
So what I'd like to do is very broadly ask each of you, and I'm going to take the interviewer's option of you're closest, so you're going to start. But we're going to go from right to left as I'm facing. A few words just about who you are, where you do what you do, and then we're going to start diving into the meat of what you do. So, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Andy Nicholes, and I'm a co-host of a Paul McCartney podcast that I do with my co-host Tom Hunyadi, and I am a graduate of Liverpool Hope University, where I earned my master's degree in the Beatles, popular music, and society.
I'm Karen Duchaj. I teach linguistics at Northeastern Illinois University here in Chicago. I didn't take any Beatle courses, but I am in the process of creating one that I'll be teaching myself.
I'm Kit O'Toole, and I've written book songs for singing guided tours through the Beatles' lesser-known tracks. I am also co-host of Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast, and I've also co-edited, right here with Ken Womack, Fandom in the Beatles, the active known for all these years, and I've presented at several academic conferences.
All right, I'm Ken Womack. It's nice to see everybody. I guess restricting things to my academic credentials and my work on the Beatles. I'm professor of English and popular music at Monmouth University on the Jersey Shore. Come and visit us. Home of the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. In terms of my academic work, I realized very early on as I was attempting to publish and not perish, I realized when I got to Penn State, I did not want to be one of the people who perish. That sounded really bad. And in fact, at first I didn't know if they killed you. or something like that, some sort of summary execution. Apparently they don't, they just execute your career. But in any event, my first Beatles book was Reading the Beatles with SUNY Press, and that really got me started thinking that one of the ways we could elevate this field of Beatles studies would be to publish with the university press's collection of essays by scholars. And I think I've done 5 or 6 of these things, maybe 6. It was my wife's idea to have the Cambridge Companion to the Beatles. We were in Cambridge, I think it was, and she said, there's a Cambridge Companion to Mozart, what the hell? And so I pitched it to them, and they bought into it. Now they have, I think, dozens and dozens of popular music titles. So my interest really is elevating not only the scholarship, but the study of the Beatles as an art form.
My name is Chen. I was a research assistant professor at the Baylor College of Medicine. My degree is in bioinformatics, so I'm sure you're all sitting out there going, what's he doing up there?
I was going to ask.
Well, sometimes I'm not sure myself. I am co-host of One Day with Fab, a weekly Beatles podcast. So while my academic work is not strictly Beatles related, more and more science and mathematics is becoming something that is intertwining with the Beatles world.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to make sure that each of you talks about what areas you are displaying your expertise in. But I'm going to toss a general question to all of you, which is, all right, we've seen a lot written about John Paul, George Ringo. A lot. What distinguishes an academic approach to the subject from not just a simple picture book, but a book that 100 Davies, for instance, a biographer? So how is what you do different, distinguished from what others have done? Anybody can jump in.
I'd be happy to start. I think a lot, when I think about Beatles scholarship, I remember a professor I had during my first semester in graduate school, and she made a remark that I thought, that just couldn't be true. And we think that a lot, don't we, Karen? That just can't be true. She said, the best biographical scholarship is written as you get further and further away from the onset of the art form, and further and further away from the parties being alive. And I thought, well, that just can't be true. But I think it is, in fact, very, very true. And we're seeing that in Beatles scholarship, that it gets better and better. What separates scholarship from, say, popular press writing or other kinds of composition is attention to source material, right? Making distinctions about which source materials have validity and which do not, which have critical forcefulness, that sort of thing. But then also doing the kind of investigative legwork to find new ways of explaining phenomenon, right? So why did the Beatles happen? You know, it didn't just have to happen. We like to believe that, but scholarship shows us through that kind of historical investigation, what were those factors that led to it? You know, and of course, there are thousands, quite factually, literally thousands of reasons why they happen, but that's the difference, I would say.
Anybody else?
Well, in my case, I think there's also a matter of being able to please 2 audiences. And for me, especially with like my academic presentations at conferences, I also have to convince my own department that this is a worthwhile thing for them to support me on, which, you know, at first glance, one might not think, you know, why should we pay to send you to New Jersey? For what? So it's about letting them see the work and having this work where I can say, this is linguistics. That's my field. Mm-hmm. This is linguistics, and nobody in the department would disagree with that. At the same time, saying to my Beatle audiences, and to myself, honestly, I'm my biggest audience member, saying this is interesting, and I think that's part of what characterizes the academic stuff, at least for me, is if it's not going to please the chair and everybody else in my department, then it's not academic enough.
Interesting.
Well, and to pick up from there, with my training, what I'm going to say is it's application of the scientific method to the history of the band, the history of these four guys. We like to think a lot of things. We're making hypotheses. How are we going to go about proving these hypotheses? One of the ways we do that is through historical research, talking to people, doing what Ken here does, and looking through the source material and saying, this is right or this isn't right, in my opinion. And then, trying to put together a complete story.
And also, I think what's fascinating and with just the really rapid growth of academic research over time is the different perspectives, the different lenses that you can look at and analyze the Beatles. I mean, I'm sure many of you may be aware of Candy Leonard's book, Beatleness, that came out some years ago. That's a sociological perspective.
And an excellent book, by the way. Just a quick aside is that you'd think it's a sociology book, it might be dull. It's not at all.
Right.
It's absolutely fantastic. Candy Leonard's book, Beatleness, fabulous book. You should look for it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so there are different perspectives through which you can look at the Beatles and look at, why, and Ken's in my book, I'm Phantom of the Beatles. I mean, we look at, the aspect of fandom. There's even a whole genre or whatever, area of study called fan studies. And so, there are just so many areas where you can research the Beatles, and of course, there's musicology. I mean, there are just so many ways, and it just brings new perspectives and new ways of looking at the Beatles and learning more about them.
Piggybacking on Ken and Kit, my degree in Liverpool, I spent 2 years in Liverpool, and I think we as North Americans really can get an education by immersing ourselves in that culture. And it was eye-opening to really see the why that Ken and Kit talk about, what things happen culturally to allow the Beatles to happen. And that was the study of my program. So it was a lot of ethnographic research and studies and fandom, looking at events in history that happened post-war and allowed it to happen. And really, those things was almost like it wasn't really about the Beatles. We didn't sit around discussing Hey Jude and when it was recorded. It was discussing these historical things that happened after the war that allowed the Beatles to emerge in England post-war.
I think there's a misconception. I've noticed this among people who have the degree that you have or other more academic studies. There's a misconception that when you get this master's degree, which the one you took no longer exists, that program no longer exists, but the University of Liverpool has taken over and has a new master's program there. And there's a misconception that it's about the trivia, which it's not. It's actually more history study. And it's I think that's important to note.
Then the best word you said just now was immersion, right? To really, and I think in that way, many of us in this room are Beatles scholars, right? Because you're immersed. I'm looking at a lot of folks who read a lot of Beatles books and think deeply about this subject, about the music, and virtually every, if not every aspect about the band and their cultural moment. Immersion is why our good friend who's here at the conference, Mark Lewison, right, is doing his great work and is immersed for a very long time in carrying out that work. And of course, immersion is important because it's what allows you to find those connections that in year one, you were sure you were smart enough to see, but you needed to be there in year 11. In fact, year 11, which by the way is 4 years longer than the Beatles worked in the recording studio, and that's when you make that very important connection between various events, etc. So it's immersion. You nailed it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, totally what it was.
You have opened the door. I've just put this into my files, Ken. So, quoting the best time to do really solid scholarly research. So, we still have to wait for Paul and Ringo to go to the great music beyond. And then we could do some serious scholarship.
No.
Well, I don't think that any of the serious scholars are actually talking to Paul and Ringo anymore, to be honest with you.
Well, and let's face it, so, of course, there's a third person, and that makes this a triumvirate, that's Yoko Ono, right? And these are very powerful people. You know, Ringo's a nice guy, he eats a lot of broccoli, but he wields plenty of cultural power. You know, I would certainly not cross Ringo.
Okay.
So my point, though, is, you know, while these figures are alive, the story is going to be told a certain way.
It's going to be filtered, filtered because they have the ability to filter it.
Sure, they have the ability to filter it, or probably conversely and even more powerfully, not to comment at all, right? So there could be a new moment, and there have been many in Beatles scholarship who've learned something and they're silent. You know, and so what we're missing there is that level of perspective, but you can still get that even after they pass away.
I'm going to start here again. Now let's go into a little bit of detail as to what are you looking at now? You know, what are some of the elements that really jumped out at you? I'll speak as a person from Chicago, understanding, looking back in growing up when the Beatles grew up. So was there a draft? Did they have to serve? If they didn't have to serve, how did that affect their opportunities? Brian did serve. How did that affect? So in other words, there are these things that you don't think about as part of the Beatles story, but it is part of growing up in that era story, which is, I would think, vital.
Incredible. And I think really, you don't really experience that until you're over there and you're meeting these people. I can remember one time we spoke to a man by the name of Joe Flannery. I don't know if anybody knows about Joe Flannery, but he's a forgotten guy in the Beatles' tale. There you go, there's somebody who knows Joe. I came to our class, lectured to us, had Paul McCartney and the Beatles, took care of them for a while. He was their booking agent for a while with Brian Epstein. And those kind of lost histories for an North American fan is invaluable to learn because you'll never really get that here in this country without going over there. And those histories, just as they, one after the other, we had people coming over telling us stories about, you know, what John did in 1960. It was incredible. These kind of first-hand approaches that you kind of get from people that you would never get anywhere else as an, again, like speaking as an American because we have to, and these are things that we take for granted until you're there. And it's 10 years, it's been 10 years ago, and it's still, I can remember every moment.
And the flip of that might be those from Great Britain not realizing the particular power of images in the US in terms of shaping how this group was perceived. That perhaps the Beatles cartoon show is every bit as important as them being in person, because that's how a generation saw them. And unless you've immersed yourself in that, your points of reference would be limited from what helped formulate the popular image at the time. So, Ken, what do you?
Well, thinking about the fact, of course, that not only were they British, but from Liverpool, part of what's going to be going on in my course, which is going to be upper undergraduate, sort of like junior, senior level, is going to be spending a lot of time comparing dialects. Mm-hmm. And most of my students, I'm going to guess ahead of time, haven't been to Liverpool, don't know the different social classes, the different geography within the city itself, and don't understand how this way of speaking relates to themselves. You know, to bring it home to the students, you know, when they hear someone who speaks differently from themselves, you know, how do they interpret that? So I never had the opportunity to take the classes. I did actually rush over there in the middle of the pandemic last August for 17 days because I wanted to go into Abbey Road Studios. But you know, so I can tell them, you know, I've been there. I've been there, you guys.
That kind of thing is important.
but a lot of a big part of my course, since it has to focus on language, is going to be about the Beatles' use of language, both in terms of their pronunciation, their word choice, their expressions. But in addition, it's going to cross over a tad with English as it gets into, you know, poetry, rhyme, and things like that. So I think I lost the train of the original question.
Actually, I'm hitching onto your train, saying that essentially what you're doing is forcing them to really look in their area of interest at something that's part of a much bigger story.
Yeah.
How about that?
That's very good. Can I put that in the brochure?
You can put that in.
Okay.
That's free.
Thank you.
So, Kit.
One of my research interests, as you know, is looking at the music that the Beatles grew up with, because it really tells you a lot about the music that they created. And so that really involves, as Andy's been talking about too, you know, really getting into history, you know, Liverpudlian history, English history, and learning about, you know, immigrants that came over and how that impacted the music. And I'll tell you, it's absolutely fascinating to learn about it. I mean, Wally and Ken were both there. I did a presentation at a Sgt. Pepper conference in 2017 on British Music Hall. And it's an absolutely fascinating area to look into, because you learn a lot about history, and you know, we've all read things, you know, where we read, oh, When I'm 64 is a nod to music hall, and then we kind of, you know, it sources, and then it just kind of moves on. But I thought, well, what is the tradition exactly? And when you dive into it, it is absolutely fascinating. You know, it teaches you about the culture of the early 1900s and so forth, and you just learn how entrenched music hall was in society. And of course, you know, Paul's father was involved in it for a brief time, and you can see how it absolutely impacted and way beyond When I'm 64. I mean, it impacted other music of theirs as well. And I've, you know, gone into some other areas, Blue Beat and others, and it's just amazing how they drew from so many different genres, and that's been, you know, a research interest of mine. And so
if
it's
I can
been,
plug,
yeah,
if I can plug Kit for one moment on this.
go right ahead.
Her presentation at the Abbey Road Conference on Swamp Pop.
Yeah.
Yes,
Primo stuff.
yes.
that was the influence of Swamp Pop on Oh Darling. Yeah, it's just a fascinating thing. I love researching it, and it just combines so many different areas, and you really, you know, it just gives you so much more insight into their music, and just how many different genres that they absorbed. And how much, you know, all these things combined create, but they just use it to create their own sound. I mean, they're not just parodying these different genres. They absolutely create something of their own. So it's something that's one of my research interests. I just love doing it.
And Karen, thank you for illustrating that in the academic world, you're constantly actually referencing other academics. You're referencing other folks who have plowed this ground. Let's see what I could do furthering these thoughts in my own research. Ken?
I've lost the train too, so
Basically, what are you doing? What are you doing now?
Sure. So I first taught a Beatles course in 2002, I think it was, a permanent course still at Penn State University, Integrative Arts, something or another, that exists, I'm happy to say. At times has 1,000 students in it because, of course, at that institution they have very large classes. One of the first things I did when I moved to Monmouth was make sure that there was a similar course. I think we call this one Introducing the Beatles or something along those lines. So I've been teaching them for about 20 years. At this point, while I feel very strongly about the class and how forceful it is, good history, all the different kinds of material, genres that I'm bringing in, of course the class and language issues that Karen describes, I'm really also trying to use it as a tool of inspiration, which is a tricky thing, because the first thing you have to acknowledge with the Beatles is that they're the outliers, right? You actually don't want to use them as your model. If that's what you're aiming for, wow, you're doomed. So they're the outlier, but that doesn't mean we still can't draw from them. And of course, one of the first lessons, and we can say the same about Steve Jobs, right? Their whole team went in an industry and knocked it over. And that team involved not only John, Paul, George, and Ringo, but of course Brian Epstein and George Martin, and they took that thing down. And they did it by problem solving. And so I like to teach the Beatles because one of the things that we take away is the ability to appreciate music, the ability to think deeply and critically about many of the issues that have been discussed here already on this panel, to think for ourselves. That's a Beatles, think for yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an important aspect too, but also to find your own way and to be able to use the lessons we can learn from them as they embark upon their careers. Because when you're 24, 22, that's when you should be trying to push over an industry on your own, right? And our students have such access and unique opportunities now with the internet and technology that the world is ripe for this kind of unsettling or upset. So I try to build in, and really spent a lot of time last year building in these kinds of ways for them to think deeply about that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so to take this in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
You go on what Ken was saying, and you go on what everyone else was saying. There is a definite value to being immersed in the primary literature in the location it was created. So, why be in Liverpool? If you can just read everything over the internet, well, you might not understand the context, even if you read all of the words. If you're in the location, people can tell you, oh, well, this is what that actually meant. So that's something that's very much worth considering when you're looking into the history of anything, but particularly of this band.
Mm-hmm. And there's the whole sense of, I read this, oh, that's rubbish. Here, let me explain what it was really like to live there. And it's not that what you read is rubbish, but it's just like if you're talking with someone who was there, they can help you cut through the preconceptions you might bring. And that's the discipline of scholar.
Because 50 years worth of people writing these books, at one point someone read the primary literature, someone said, oh, this is what went on, and then he adds his opinion, then she adds her opinion, and on down the line. And that's really what Mark Lewison is so good at doing, is he reads everything.
Well, you guys touched on a good point, if I just real make quick. One of the modules of our course was on historiography, which is the history of writing. And that, as we move on, with so many Beatle books, many of which are in that room right across over there, going through them all and learning about the history, the accepted history is what we know. Studying the historiography was really more about learning about the author and what agendas they were looking to push. We know what the accepted history is from 1962 to 19. We know that. But looking through all these authors, especially texts published before 1980 and then seeing how the narrative changes after 1980, that was fascinating. So reading like Nicholas Schaffner's books and things like that, and then looking how the narrative changes after that time, really tells you about the writer. We know the history. What's the agenda of the author here in this book? And that module of the course that I took was fascinating.
Well, and to take our favorite whipping boy, Albert Goldman. You read Lives of John Lennon. What story is he telling? He's not really telling John Lennon's story. He's telling his own story.
Exactly.
Although I'm a slight counter to my distinguished colleague from Houston, where we're both from, and that is, you can see all of Goldman's archive at Columbia University, and it's pretty compelling.
And if I may say, we had a researcher we had Albert Goldman's Liverpool researcher came to us and listen, his methods were maybe not great, but the man did a lot of research for the book. And as Ken pointed out, it's
The execution had some problems.
the execution had some, right, and the motives.
Isn't it it's about learning to separate, like you say, the true story from what people want you to hear and believe? Because everyone in the Beatles story, no matter what, has some kind of an agenda, let's be very frank. So you have to learn how to separate the agenda from the truth.
Yeah. Gentleman's name was Ron Ellis, and Ron was Goldman's Liverpool researcher for the lives of John Lennon, and he came and spoke to us, and it was pretty compelling.
He's good.
And actually, let me go back to, again, the thread that I love that Ken introduced early on. So if you had the opportunity to say, oh, and Mr. McCartney is going to come right here, and he is going to provide the definitive final word on the story. Would you accept that as being likely from Mr. McCartney providing the definitive final word on this story?
No way, and we can see, and let's face it, we all love and admire and adore what he's achieved. I think that's a commonplace and should be. Having said that, the new lyrics book, right? Here is a person at a later stage in life trying to understand his own body of work. And I'll be so bold as to say, we do it better. Almost each and every time. I mean, stories begin to stray. In the preface to his lyrics book, you see, and this is a book that I think rightly we should own. I'm not, in fact, I've given it praise in virtual print.
Right.
But my point being, there's in the preface he talks about the windscreen incident, and historically it's a mess. He has it all out of whack. That's not useful to scholarship. That's problematic, and that will mean important work for us later on to correct and amend those such moments. But that's a good case in point. No, he isn't helping us.
I would venture to say, this is something that I noticed when the anthology book came out, that there were contradictory stories from each Beatle about the same incident.
But they left them all in.
Yes, they left them all in. But how do you separate the truth out of that too? They
But
all
at least
remember
we get the option. I love that.
But they all remember it differently, so, when you're getting it only from one of them, certainly you're going to hear what he wants you to hear. But the thing is, since all four of them, including the one who wasn't alive at the time the book came out, tell the same story in four different ways, how do you separate the truth and find out because like you say, we all know the history, we're hearing the stories from the people who lived it, they're all different, including the history we think we know. How do you get to the bottom of that truth?
Such a great question. I'm going to interrupt because you brought up something really good, and that is, which you typically do, by the way, SRR, and that is, what we have to sift through.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a world where David Sheff had not conducted those Playboy interviews and done so with the sort of language game that he came up with, or experiment? Let's talk about every song and tell me what you think of it. Now, John said several things that I don't think he would have thought even the next year or 5 years later. But I cannot imagine where we would be if we didn't have what turned out to be the final word.
Exactly.
But great question about those distinctions.
And actually, if I could pick up on that thread for a moment, it's not just going to the context. It's not just talking to the subjects, but how that interview was presented, how that interview, what struck me in particular was his description of how Lennon looked almost fondly at Sometime in New York City. That was the only title in all of the albums that he said, wow, it's great to see this one again. Now, I'm not trying to read anything into that, but that is an impression that he had as an interviewer of that primary source. He has captured that impression, shared that impression. Whatever you want to do with it, it's fine. But to me, it signals this was important to the subject. This was a moment that he thought they had done something special. And that's the kind of thorough research that you folks do. That you find the source and don't just say, I've got it indexed. I spell checked it, whatever. But another, what does this mean? What does this mean? Let's think about what this means. And as you say, Ken, you might think you know in year 1, and then year 11 you go, wait a minute, I hadn't realized such and such. On second thought, let me revisit that first impression.
I was wrong.
And so does an academic ever say, I was wrong?
Oh, I think many times you have to, but yeah, I mean, this is definitely a good point because, and actually many of you, as Ken rightly pointed out, I mean, we're kind of all scholars here in a way because you've all, and there are some authors in the room right here, who can sympathize with this, is when you're doing research, I mean, yeah, you've got to look at the sources very carefully, but, is there an agenda here behind the author who, wrote the particular book you're looking at, or of course, the interviews themselves with, like say, John, I mean, he changed his mind a lot in interviews. What mood was he in that particular day? Was he mad at Paul at that particular time? And was, in the 1970 Rolling Stone interview, he said a lot of stuff, and then he a lot of times dismissed his own songs, and so you have to kind of approach those interviews with some caution. So it's really difficult. You've really got to do your homework and look at the sources that author cites, and it can be hard to you really have to do your homework to determine if these are credible sources to cite.
Can we get a little example here from Ken? So we got 3 stories as regards to what happened when the Beatles met Elvis. You have Ringo who says that they jammed with Elvis. You have John who says, "Oh, we never jammed with Elvis," and you have Mal Evans who has memories of going into the kitchen and making picks out of plastic spoons. How are you going to reconcile those 3 stories?
Well, in my case, when you deal with a primary subject, right, and not 4 subjects, I don't really care what the others thought. I only care what Mal thought. I can deal with some issues, and I've only had to do this a few times, but in footnotes, where you can sort of disentangle or disaggregate some of the challenges. But, in this case, the primary source, which I'm announcing for the first time here, I guess, is about 30 pages that Mal wrote about it in a manuscript that was not published during his lifetime. He actually wrote it in 1965. And he put it all down on record. Now, that's a pretty valuable record, right? Scholars, why? Contemporaneity. It was written with direct memories on what happened. So Mal describes Elvis's TV. He describes the state of the room, who was there, the Memphis Mafia. What was everybody doing? What was Ringo doing? What was John? What songs they played, et cetera, et cetera. So he thinks they jammed. Okay, that's the answer to the question.
And he did in 1965, so.
Yeah, that's the most important fact. It's a contemporaneous document. By 1975, when he's writing about it again, you can see him drifting in some of his memories. His memories are starting to drift about what happened. So whenever you can find a primary source that's not the source, you're in great stead. We have one in this room right now. Did you know that? We do. In March 1967, Mal drew this self-portrait and mailed it to this woman right here, Georgiana Slaboff. Say hi to everybody. And through the auspices of our interconnected world, we're able to work together with my colleague Peter Hicks and come together. Now we have access to this incredible self-portrait at the height of Sgt. Pepper, right? You can see this is Mal. What do you call that? The kind of self-portrait? Thank you. I know it's a self-portrait, Peter. Thank you for that. No, but with the kind of sideburns and the way he cut his beard, like the Beatles did at that time. So, when you have a person like this who has memories that can be recounted, you work with a source like that. Now, I love Georgiana. I will say it in public. I love you too. But she's wonderful. But she knows very well that when we talk about her ideas, and she's put many of them down on paper, I'm going to go to the diaries that Mal had and double check those dates, right? In fact, we've done it together, and sure enough, she's right every time. This is a really good source. But there are plenty of them when you talk to them, and you find very quickly that they don't check out. We love Jeff Emmerich. Yes, Karen's face says it all. But that's a highly problematic book.
I carried his book in my purse in Abbey Road Studios.
And we love the book.
Just so I could pull it out.
But you know what? It doesn't check out.
Well,
A lot of the diaries, he'll have Mal in the studio. He's not anywhere near it. He's 500 miles away.
and just to inject one further element to the Mal Evans recounting that I am imagining, since I haven't read the diaries, but context, again, we're talking about context, in that not only is when he did this, but to know the type of person he was while doing it. I believe it's accurate to say that was an Elvis fan. So he would care tremendously the details of that moment.
Let me throw that
meant
back
something.
to you, Wally Prodrazik, who, by the way, when I discovered Beatles scholarship in 1977, what books did my father bring home from the Houston Public Library? The work of Womack, Duchaj, and Harry Kaplan, which, by the way, are very careful works of scholarship. He actually called Mel Evans up on the phone when he lived out in California with some questions. So
Yeah, and that, when I was talking about the context, it's not just, well, I went to Liverpool and I talked to somebody there, but
you
when,
let your fingers do the walking.
yeah, when we had just a couple of arcane questions, but very straightforward, factual questions.
But let me flip back on you. So here's my question to you. You mentioned Mal loved Elvis.
Yeah.
You bet. Every moment he was recording with the deepest senses of his memory. But and the panel might want to talk about this too. How does that also make him a problematic source?
Well, sure.
Well, the hero worship certainly shows, and then you have to see how much of that was because he loved the guy, so that's questionable
So
as well.
again, and panel, please pick up on this, but then again, it means he intensely is looking at every moment and wants to capture every moment and see every moment of his hero, who probably can't do anything, and then this, and then suddenly he's caught up in the excitement of being with his hero.
A good example is Elvis and Priscilla. Right? Mal sees this and thinks, oh, this is the most wonderful relationship. Look, there they are, the queen and king of my dreams, And there are others who are in that room thinking, that's an icy, cold distance between the two of them.
Yeah.
And we could extrapolate and talk about John and Yoko and the way people have witnessed them. Some believe that they see this kind of icy disconnection, and others see, even to the last moment, a deep loving couple. And that may be the agenda that Karen was talking about, right? The kind of agendas that people take into that work. Wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, I was also going to, I hope this doesn't veer too far off, but I'm
You
thinking
can
that.
hear wherever you wish.
Well, I'm thinking thank you, I like to veer. That there may be, I don't know, sort of the elephant in the room here of people wondering, well, gee, but isn't academic stuff really, really boring and unreadable? And I was thinking, when we were talking about, pleasing, or maybe not pleasing, but certainly not getting in the way of the Beatles who are still alive and Yoko and everything, and upsetting anybody. And I was thinking that while my esteemed colleagues here are excellent at writing for real people, writing for the public, writing scholarly works that are read and enjoyed by regular people, part of that reputation of academia is actually true. That there is all kinds of stuff published that 5 people read, and maybe someone requires it as a textbook for their course, but it'll disappear into the proceedings of this conference or working papers from this university. And, after not even 20 years, it's maybe a few people have seen it. And some of the stuff, before the internet, never made it onto the internet. So there's maybe a dusty old paper from 1995 that says everything we want to read, but we don't know where it is. We don't know how to find it. And it's, there's something about academia being, it's in part its own little area, its own little world with, I see some people nodding, with a very small, select audience, and where other people, I've even warned my own family and friends, you don't necessarily want to read this stuff. You'll be bored, you'll fall asleep, you'll get lost in the tables and the footnotes. But the ability, the talent, which I see in you guys especially, the talent of taking that kind of very disciplined and critical and complete look and making it so everybody wants to read it, is really a crossover that we don't always think academics are able to make.
Do you think, Karen, though, that that's partially, in this case, the subject matter? Because, it's one thing to have a really deeply academic paper about something that's not as pop culture accessible as the Beatles, and then it's another to write an academic work about the Beatles, who are very popularly accessible. So I wonder sometimes if it's the subject matter.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I've started to read academic articles about things that I enjoy. And pop culture, the Beatles, maybe Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, stuff. And, you get to like the fourth page and it's like, oh my God, just kill me now.
But there is a lot of highly academic work that is actually highly accessible as well. I mean, another one that I can think of off the top of my head is Christine Feldman Barrett's Women's History of the Beatles. And it's highly accessible. If you don't know about this, is a woman, she's actually from Chicago, but she's a professor in Australia, Christine Feldman Barrett, and some of us were lucky enough to meet her at the conference, at the White Album Conference in Monmouth, and she just wrote a book that came out last year, or at the beginning of this year, called The Women's History of the Beatles, and she interviewed a lot of women, and she talked about the influence of the Beatles' wives, and she talked about other women in the Beatles' story, and it's definitely an academic book. It's published by an academic publisher. It's got chock full of footnotes and indices, but it is also highly, highly accessible. By the way, an excellent book if you really want to get your hands on a different perspective, because it's a subject she could not believe anybody had never touched before. But, the point is, she took this potentially arcane kind of subject and she made it really accessible. And it's still very highly academic and highly researched and highly footnoted, but it's really, like Candy Leonard's book, accessible to anyone. So I think it depends on how you approach the subject as well.
But does scholarship need to be accessible, right? You mentioned, so here's my question to you, Karen. So those, and there are hundreds, maybe thousands of texts that we probably should find that don't exist in the internet age because they predate it and they weren't published by a venue that was resourceful enough to be reprinted or what have you, digitized. What's the job of the scholar then when you know, and this is very true in linguistics, isn't it? There are hundreds of Beatles studies out there that would be very important to understanding access, culture, and class distinction, etc. What is the duty of the scholar at that point? It sure is easier to work with LexisNexis and ProQuest. And
I think, well, assuming you can find that they exist. I mean, one of the seminal papers I used for my pronunciation of George Harrison's study was it was a typed dissertation, typed like on a typewriter in 1973, and somebody somewhere had scanned it and like had it in their own personal website as a PDF, and it's like, yeah, tracking that kind of stuff. No index, right? You're going to read the whole 80 pages, or you're at least going to look through them. But yeah, it's. I guess the job is to do what you can. There's always a deadline, or at least in my life, there's always a deadline. There's a point when, you know that old joke, there are two kinds of dissertations, perfect and done. And there's always a deadline at which point you go, well, that's it. That's as far as I could get with this.
No writing project is finished, only ended.
Yeah, that's right.
I know, Kit, you want to jump in and then we're going to throw maybe a wrap-up question to all of you.
I was just going to say, because I really wanted to get this title out in this panel, with regards to the subject of accessibility, who's going to sit down and read Assessing Authorship of Beatles Songs from Musical Content, Basing Classification Modeling from Bags of Words? Probably nobody. It's a really fascinating paper, and what it tells us is who is likely to have written in my life.
Yeah,
that's the goal of this paper.
I've seen that paper referenced in other places. I've read the paper itself, but I've definitely seen it referenced. I've used it.
Well, and unless you're me, or unless you're someone who has a reasonably solid basis in statistics, you're not going to give anything other than the summary, which says, oh, well, if you do this, and this, we can prove that.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right.
So,
Andy, I wanted to ask you, what was your master's thesis as part of the program?
Oh, my thesis was actually on wings, believe it or not, go figure. And trying to prove a point that the American rock press had a bias against Paul McCartney and Wings in the early 70s.
Which is vital, by the way, to understanding the way those early solo years unfold, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't tell you how many trips I made to the British Library from Liverpool. In England, you actually need to get a reader's pass to actually access the archives at the British Library. You can't just walk in and say, oh, I want to look at the London Evening Standard. You can't. You have to have a pass. It's a hugely involved thing. And but I went through it and got all the articles that I needed to get. But learning that, how to do that, historiography was part of the class. So going through that part of the class was difficult because it's like, well, how do we know? But then when I figured out how to do it, okay, now I know I've got to start here and compile it. I ended up writing like a 80-page dissertation and got a good mark on it.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I would like to offer you all a puzzle for the future. I did an interview last week with at the Midland Authors Society, someone who wrote a book about Woodstock, the festival. 900-page book, of which at least 100 pages are citations, etc. And he said one of the things that's frustrating for him is when you start citing online sources, whether they be actual videos or published, printed analyses and all, there's no guarantee that 5 years after you see print, they even exist. That is, it's one thing to say, oh, it's too bad no one knows that this typed dissertation is sitting in the archives of Monmouth from however many years ago. But it's like, well, it existed, except no, it doesn't. So what are some of the challenges of the era that we're in now in terms of making sure not only that you can do good scholarship research, but for God's sake, preserve good scholarship research? And if you don't have an answer, that's okay. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Let's face it, we've learned a really good answer to this question from Mr. Lewison, which is, not only do you do the research that you can do online in many cases, but if you look at the original source, going back to what Andy said, if you're looking at the document, if you're looking at the issue of NME, right, from a certain date in pick a year in the 60s, you see the advertisements that are around.
Mm-hmm.
You see what it's juxtaposed again. I was having fun working in advance of this fest, looking at the 1975 program and how Mark was heralding the coming Robert Stigwood film, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What an amazing thing that will be! It will be such a shining light for Frampton and the Bee Gees, right? But that is also part of the experience, is holding the document, you know, and that's why what Andy describes as such important research. If you can't find the document anymore and you know it exists, I mean, I let my fingers still do the walking. What a dead reference that is, right? but true, right? I have called many times folks who are no longer in the academy and said, I see you have a dissertation on this. I can't find it anywhere. Can you send me a copy? I mean, 10 times I've done this. First of all, they love it.
Oh, sure.
They're like, you know about my piece on amphibious blah blah blah. You know, they're thrilled about it. But that's part of the joy of exploration. I believe JR has a question for the.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't stand in his way.
Chicago Manual Style has already addressed this. In citation, we give date and time with that, as that will give you point of access, which with additional sources such as archive.org, you can use that to cross-reference.
That I absolutely respect that as a way of at least time stamping what you got, when you got it, when you got it. If it's disappeared and is not otherwise available, it's still disappeared. But yeah, that's what I was doing on a recent paper. It was like citing it by time and date access. Yeah.
Which is why I used online sources when I wrote mine, and just the website, the date, and the time, and that was good enough for them.
That got you your A.
Yeah, no, it did, but it helped though.
Anybody else? Anybody else out there? Oh my goodness, yes. Okay, yeah. Yes.
Why do you think they didn't hire an editor or a fact checker for that book? Because Paul was in the late 70s then and had several inaccuracies in those interviews, which is to be expected because you can't remember everything that happened many years ago. But they could have hired somebody to fact check or edit what he said.
I am stunned by that myself. I was looking recently. Paul had confused his 1966 trip with Mao to Kenya with the 1967 trip for Jane Asher's birthday. It happened a long time ago in his life. I get that, but why weren't there people to help him with that? And most of this room could do that, right? I mean, no, very seriously, would be able to say, well, no, they came up with Sgt. Pepper before the album was recorded, not after. You know, that sort of thing. And I've been stunned by that, where they're not asking those hard questions. Maybe his editor at Princeton, what is the poet's name?
I think Paul resents fact checkers.
I'm not even part of your panel. I was going to say, I think his ego may not have allowed that. Okay.
Yes, I have a question about you referenced the bias against Paul. I'd actually like to read your paper, but
Sure.
most people feel, or it seems like there was a bias against him.
Yeah.
And it emanated from John.
Yep.
And his interviews with Jan Wenner.
Yep.
Well, I wanted to see if you would agree with that. And then B, why do you think they went with it? Why did they pile on Paul in such a negative way?
I have a very simple answer for this. People didn't want the Beatles to break up.
Paul broke up the Beatles.
People did not want it to end. And he's the guy that sued him. He's villain number one. I find it very simple. They didn't want it to end. And it was easy once Paul sued him to do that.
Well, and Jan was friends with John.
Exactly.
And, so if John, if John says, no, Ram's a piece of, what?
Right.
Okay, whatever you say, John. We got a good review of Ram? Well, we'll publish it or we'll bury it. And make sure this bad review also comes out.
Yeah.
Okay, we got like one or two more questions. Go.
Okay, I real quick want to jump back to the previous question about being disappointed that Paul wouldn't have fact checkers. I think even if you go back to the 70s, the Beatles always mixed up their information. And John Lennon in the 1980s was talking in one of his last interviews about the last tour. He said the last tour, which was 65, I think, or 66. He doesn't know. You know why? Because he doesn't study the Beatles, and we study the Beatles. We know more than they do. So they've always gotten it wrong. They're probably going to continue to get it wrong because we know the details in their life story better than they do, and they've acknowledged that as well. So I don't think it's even a matter of his age. I think he's remembering a lot, and it would be just the same as it was 20 years ago.
Well, I mean, that kind of goes back to what I said before, that, you know, serious historians are not going to listen to what Paul and Ringo have to say these days.
One last question and then we'll wrap up.
More of a philosophical, perhaps, question, but just what we've been talking about the biases or lack of biases in terms of Paul's career with Wings that Annie referenced, and the whole who broke up the Beatles and who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. These are almost like religious, theological questions by now. But so how do all of you guys, you ladies, this panel see the role of academia at this point in dealing with these larger questions from an academic bias? Because, you know, the person in the street, they have all that mythology of 20, 30 years now. So what do you guys do to try to counter it with better narratives?
Well, you can't make them read, right? So, as this fella said, you know, we all take the time to go to the sources and familiarize ourselves with them. But part of what we need to teach, because we do have a very large educated public, part of what we need to teach in class is critical thinking, all of the tenets that everybody's been describing, historiography, just basic ideas about conducting research so that people can get at the truth, which of course we have a big problem with right now, right, in society. I don't know if anybody's noticed. It's been kind of a thing. And part of what we need to do better in the academy is help people to be able to make judgments. Sometimes judgments that might go against their own agenda and their own bias, right? Where they have to look at two pieces of evidence and think, even using common sense, that probably didn't happen. Because this sort of thing doesn't happen and this thing does, right? But also being able to use evidence. So I think part of our job is to keep instilling those levels of value. And I see our students now starting to do that. It's taken many decades for us to get there, but I've seen them in recent years start to apply these kinds of, it could be the scientific method, you know, this kind of thinking as they live their everyday lives, right? And not just Beatles, which of course should be their everyday lives, but you know, the long arc of truth, Obama, et cetera, that quote sort of helps us understand.
So I think we need to wrap it up, yes? So I want to thank our panelists, Andy, Karen, Kit, Ken, and Ed. Stick around because Tom Frangione is here for Name That Tune for the next hour, and then right after Tom, Kit, and Karen, and I will be back along with another bunch of panelists for the historians panel discussing Get Back. So please hang around and enjoy, and thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you very much.